Hello, I'm Eric Matisik, co-chair of Denver Startup Week. Last year, we were able to bring the global audience together for Denver Startup Week, and this year, we're excited to welcome that global audience back as we celebrate and showcase the best of entrepreneurship that the Denver ecosystem in Colorado has to offer, in Denver and beyond. There are lots to explore this week, but most importantly, we're excited that you're joining us. We have nearly 50 sponsor companies who contribute to make Denver Startup Week possible. Let's show our love for these companies today and all week long. Thanks to our headquarters and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors whose leadership makes this week come to life, Capital One Cafe, the Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork, and our track sponsors who've made all the great content you're hearing today possible, which includes our founder track sponsor, Kickstart, our growth track sponsor, Friday Health Plans, developer track sponsor, Quizlet, product track sponsor, Palantir, design track sponsor, Battery 621 and the Public Works, people track sponsor Exactly, and the spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing this excitement to the entire week. Thank you to B-Side Fund, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and the VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our sponsors and member sponsors who are listed on the screen, and thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, let's get to it.
Hello, Denver. We are so excited to be here. We're excited to tell you a bit more about the Foundry for Builders program and to be a part of the Denver startup ecosystem. We moved our headquarters to Denver in the last year, and we're excited to call Denver home. Foundry for Builders, essentially we're offering our end-to-end Foundry solution that is deployed to major governments and enterprises worldwide to early and growth stage companies so that they can build their business on Foundry from day one.
Hi everyone, welcome to Denver Startup Week. My name is Ryan Margolis and I'm the Product Track Chair and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Denver Startup Week. At DSW, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, or sexual orientation. A special thank you to our sponsors for their support in helping us to keep DSW free and accessible for all. Thank you for joining us. Have a great week.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you all have had such a great week so far attending other sessions. My name is Justjeet Monget. I am a product manager. I was recently just at Havenly for the last year and a half based here in Denver, working as a senior product manager on the core experience. And am soon heading to Hinge, where I'll also be working on product for the core experience. And so I'm in that fun 3 weeks where, called fun employment, as I'd like to refer to it as, and really excited to spend some of that time with you all here today, talking about something that I hold really close to my own heart around product inclusion and more broadly, DEI efforts, as Ryan just mentioned in that video. So really excited to talk more about what product inclusion is and how it can apply to you in your workplace. And I am joined by my friend Soren. Soren, you want to take it away?
Hi, everyone. I'm Soren. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a former product designer, now a manager of UX and digital design. I just joined Benjamin Moore recently, and I worked for some fintechs and some software as a service companies before, a few agencies as well. So I'm coming with a perspective of also a person that is marginalized and benefits from inclusive design. And I work a lot with accessibility as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So we're going to cruise through a presentation where we'll be talking a lot about what is product inclusion, but throughout the way, we'll be pausing, asking you all to reflect on some of these key questions for yourselves and how they apply to you. So if you have a pen and paper, that is super great. And even better, you can put your answers in the chat below. So feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function. We will have time at the end for questions, but as we go, just to make this, pretend like we were all in person together, putting your answers in chat will be really helpful too, so we can kind of keep the dialogue going. All right, with that, let's jump into it. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, Soren, you want to give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Awesome, thanks. Okay. So welcome. We're going to start off before even trying to define what is product inclusion and any of that, to start off really broadly and with some ground rules here. So just a reminder, even though we're working with chat and all of that, there's some key rules here around making sure that we all understand that all ideas are welcome and respected. Please feel comfortable putting any idea into the chat. Also, same goes for all questions and all concerns. So the short of it is that when we're talking about inclusion and we're talking about diversity, it's not always the easiest topic to talk about. And so it's really important that we create safety in this space that we have together here and understand that everyone has a voice and that voice matters. Cool. So let's start it off. If everyone would mind putting into the chat, what is your favorite consumer product? It can be a digital product or a physical product. Would love to hear kind of what is your favorite. TikTok, yes, Hannah, great app. Let's see if we get any other. Venmo, also great. Insight Timer. Maps, yep, Onyx. Cool. Yeah, keep them coming. The next question, so one of my favorite consumer products is the iPhone. I'm on it all the time, using all of my various apps, and I love the consistency of the app as well. Soren, what about you?
Yeah, I have to say, when thinking about the iPhone, I really love the accessibility options that it provides. I also really love, as far as like maybe an app or something digital, I really love the portability of like having Adobe products on my phone as well, because it lets you take photos and things on the go, and sometimes you can do some of your work there and then transfer it to the computer.
Yeah, that's great, and a great point around the accessibility piece as well. All right, next question. Keep that product in mind. Do you think this product was made with you in mind specifically? This might be one that you want to reflect on. So just kind of thinking about like some of the answers in the chat and thinking about when the person or the team that came up with this product was building it, kind of, do you think they had you in mind? And the example I'll continue to use here is the iPhone. I actually think the iPhone does a really good job of trying to be accessible to everyone and really considering all of the various users. But I'm seeing in the chat here or on TikTok, Hannah has a great point that it was made for a subset of users, and maybe that user includes you, but there's definitely products out in the world that were not made for all of us in mind. So just to cruise through a few examples here, mostly focused on physical products. If you think about Band-Aids or makeup, those two focus mostly on skin tone and thinking about this idea of the color neutral, right? So ballet flats is a really good example too. They were all made to a specific skin tone and created to blend in, but that didn't account for the fact originally that there were very many types of skin tones. Similarly, if you think about the original Barbie was made with a very specific gender, a very specific skin tone, hair color, hair texture, body type. And as we all know, that is not reflective of those of us here in the world. And so I think across makeup and consumer products like Barbie, we've seen a lot of changes in that. But originally, and even to this day, many products are not. A couple other examples that I've included here are like a power gel. So a power gel isn't even, very specific to the male gender. It's very specific to not just males, but really like burly men or like men who really love to, it has a connotation to a very specific type of man, and doesn't always apply to everyone else who needs a power gel. This middle example here is around a physical design, so architecture, this idea of like glass ceilings really trending during a certain point, but maybe didn't always consider you would have to be wearing pants in order for that to always work, right? So trying to think of our physical spaces as well when we think about inclusion. And then this last example here is around the election ballot. So when we think about inclusive language and making sure that voting accessibility is not just the ability to get your ballot, but to also understand what is on that ballot. And do you understand it enough to make an informed selection on whatever that topic might be? I know, Soren, you had some examples here around forms that you've worked on previously. Did you want to share any of those?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of the like honorifics that people have on forms, and it's definitely been a blocker when, just even signing up recently for a medical study for folks with autism. I got to gender and it said male and female, and I was like, how do I continue? Like that, totally. I feel like those two things don't describe my gender. And then on a lot of forms, they say like Mr., Mrs., Miss, and I feel like none of those really describe me. And not even just for folks that are gender queer, gender nonconforming, or non-binary. You can think about folks that maybe just don't really want to use an honorific, or maybe that's not a kind of honorific they would use in their culture. It's just not inclusive when you force people to go into like very specific routes and you don't give them an option to proceed without having to choose one of these choices, especially when that data isn't necessary. So if I'm booking a hotel room, why do you need to know my gender? If I'm booking a hotel room, why do you need to know my honorific? It's not a required field.
Yep. And just to pull from one of the examples in the chat here, Venmo, an app I use every single day, right? But it requires a bank account. And so not everyone has access to that. And to get a bank account, you often need, almost always need a social security number, right? So it's very excluding parts of our population that might not have access to those types of documents or information. And I think your example is really great too, Soren, around like, do you need to know that information? For a bank account, it might be one thing, obviously, but for a hotel form, do you need to know gender? That's a great point. Okay, so here we are. That is why we are here today talking about product inclusion. So by definition, and this is defined by Google, a lot of the content that you're going to see in this presentation is based off a book called Building for Everyone, which is an incredible book. If you haven't read it, I would suggest definitely grab it or listen to the audio version of it. It's really great at breaking down this idea around building for everyone with everyone in mind. And it's how do you do that, not just at the output or at the design phase, but actually making sure you're doing it within the discovery phase, all the way through testing and deployment and marketing as well. So making sure that we don't just think about this specific to the product process, but also our cross-functional business partners, ensuring that it's being considered when we think about marketing, when we think about operationalizing something, even when it comes to product feedback through customer support, whatever that might be for your organization. So a couple of examples here, kind of keeping that thread going around the Barbie. Obviously, we've seen Barbie change, which is amazing. We've seen Barbie now in very different skin tones, different hair textures, different body size, which I think is really important when especially as we think about the key user for a Barbie. That feels weird to say, but obviously that's young girls and young children, and they're interacting with these toys that really do start to influence the way they think about themselves and the way they think about the world around them. And so physical products, that's an example there. And then what Soren mentioned, we're starting to see more inclusive design when we think and product decisions being made when we look at forms. So we're seeing the ability to select a pronoun right in your own if none of the ones that are there apply to you. We're seeing them be removed from things if it's not a necessary key piece of information to know. Another example around forms is when you think about applying for jobs and if you're being asked to check a box if you've been previously incarcerated, right? I think a lot of organizations are starting to wake up to the fact that maybe they don't necessarily care if you've been previously incarcerated, or maybe they want to know, but it's not going to be a decision as to like whether you're even prevented from applying at all. So that's around like forms. You can think it applies very much to the census, voter ballots, things like that. And then FaceTime or physical products, right? So in the book Building for Everyone, there's a really great example around how the camera really took into account the way that you pick up on skin tones, voice, how those things are displayed. You even notice with Siri getting much better at pronouncing names, which I personally struggle with. So it's very great to see moves being made in that direction. And even once again on the iPhone, you'll see emojis being changed too, not just in skin tone, but you'll also notice that they're more inclusive of different types of emojis that might apply to different cultures or conversation. Okay, so we know what it is. We've talked a little bit about some examples, but why should we care? And I think very much, oftentimes when we think about DEI, it's always around, well, it's the right thing to do. And it's just like, that's why we should do it, because it matters and it's important for humankind. And that is very true. And so I definitely want to acknowledge that, in my opinion, it is the right thing to do. But I also want to acknowledge that it also impacts the bottom line. I think oftentimes when we talk about inclusion, it's being weighed up against business priorities. But if DEI is considered holistically and throughout the product design process, it actually is impacting your bottom line because it's enabling your business to capture a market you don't have already and better serve the market that you already have. So we're seeing a trend now, and have been for a while, right, where consumers are making conscious decisions, not just based on the product and the price, but they're also putting their money towards companies that have the same shared values as them. So I think that as we're starting to see that trend in society, we're also seeing the monetary impact that can happen when you have a brand that prioritizes inclusion. And on the flip side, when you have a brand that doesn't, we've also seen the backlash of that, right? So if a marketing piece goes out and it may be missed or really something that was obvious to viewers, then how does that impact the value of your business? How does that impact your share price? How does that impact your growth over time and the repeating customers that you might have? And then lastly, it might be part of your mission. So I started thinking a lot about this topic when I was at Havenly, and our mission was to help everyone build a home that they love. So when we say everyone, who do we mean by that? And so I think that was a really great time to start thinking about, especially when we're thinking about the space of interior design, how do we ensure that the spaces that we live in, whether they be big or small or somewhere in between, are able to be accessed by online interior design. All right, Soren, anything to add there?
Yeah, I hated to add when we were kind of planning this session, like legal arguments. So that's one thing that I really like to stay away from, because I feel like, one, it's so varied from place to place. And then like, I think it's just kind of as a marginalized person, I feel like it's kind of a bad reason. It feels bad, at least, to be doing inclusion, because it feels like, well, okay, my mom made me invite you to my birthday party. It's very much that kind of feeling. So I really was thinking about it, and then I was like, but so much can change as as technology changes, the ability to include people changes, just as we've seen over the past 2 years, as we've all gone to more remote working, the ability for like folks with disabilities to be included more in the workplace and to have more job stability has changed greatly. So instead of positioning it as a legal argument for compliance, I would position it as future proofing. Yeah. The more inclusive design you have now, the more you are future proofing your business against future technology and innovation, and the more you're keeping up with the times now. So that's one thing I have really been thinking about like very recently.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. I've never thought of it with the word future proofing. I think that's a really great term to encapsulate the idea of like how a business grows, not just when it comes to DEI, but in general. So like this is just such a key, like to me, a foundational element of what that looks like for the future of any company. Okay, cool. So moving back into some definitional elements here, who do we mean when we say everyone? And so I think oftentimes, at least I'm very much guilty of this, when I think diversity, my brain goes to color and race and ethnicity. And that's because when I think about diversity, those elements apply to me, but it's very important to recognize that the dimensions of diversity are so broad. Here are some of them. In this graphic, you'll notice there's the inner circle and the outer circle. The inner circle is really intended to focus on the ones which we have no control over, right? So age, physical ability, race, ethnicity, things like that. Whereas in the outer sphere, we have some control over and might change over time. If we think about our educational status, we progress through an education, our income changes over time, our marital status might change, language, we start with one, we might pick up others, we might lose some over the way, and the way that we think also changes over time. So when we think about diversity, we're not just talking about race, we're not just talking about how our sexual orientation, we're talking about all of the ways in which diversity impacts ourselves, our employees, our coworkers, I should say, or even and especially our customer. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of questions, and we're actually going to start to focus on, I see a question in the chat. Where do you feel neurodiversity fits physical ability? Oh, let me go back. So I think that's right. I would put it there. Go back here. Yep. So I think that's maybe where it'd fit in. I also know that, as we think about various types of like different types of thinking, it might apply there as well in a different way. Soren, do you have thoughts there?
Yeah, I would say that it would fit in the inner sphere because like having ADHD, being autistic is not something I can control at all. But I would say that it doesn't always have to do with a physical ability. So I would say that it would be another slice, but I don't think that this diagram can be completely comprehensive. I just think these are examples of things, and it may vary also by the location that you're in, or some of these things may be more applicable or not.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna cruise into some self-reflection. Soren's gonna be the DJ and play some fun tunes for us as we think through some of these questions. Really, we're gonna walk through this self-reflective moment around who is your customer and really focusing on who you target today. Whatever's applicable for your business, everyone's answer is going to be different here, but just take a couple minutes to jot down like who is your customer. And then once you feel like you have a solid persona identified to the extent that you know your customer, right? Then I want us all to think about who else, who are you missing? And then finally, starting to think through how could you better serve the customers that are maybe excluded right now. So definitely take the time to think of them one chunk at a time, because it's really important to have a solid understanding of your current customer prior to thinking about who you might be missing. So I'll skip back to the first question there and give everyone a few minutes to jot down their thoughts. Please drop them in the chat if you feel comfortable, or on a pen and paper if you want to do some individual reflection. All right, I'm going to give everyone about 30 more seconds. All right, let's jump back into it. So feel free to drop your answers in the chat if you want, if you feel comfortable. If not, we can just talk through some examples of the way that Soren and I have been thinking about this. So I'm going to use Havenly here as an example, but really at a high level, just thinking through, when we originally did this workshop, and I did this workshop with my team, we thought about our current customer, and that customer really focused on someone who was maybe just bought a home, or maybe was moving into their next home. And it's really focused on typically women who are, want to think about redesigning their space, but and have the discretionary income to do so, but they're not entirely sure on like how they want to pull those things together. So they're leaning on the expert advice of an interior designer. And so I think that in a lot of ways, it's very accessible, right? The design package and getting started is affordable. And so that's really great in that sense. But there were definitely markets that we ideated on how we could expand into. So really thinking about people at different stages of life, thinking about gender, thinking about income, and especially thinking about language right now. We're only based here in the US, but there's definitely an opportunity to expand beyond that and really make sure that even for those customers here in the US, making sure that there's opportunity to think about interior design for other cultural needs, other space constraints, other budget constraints, things like that. So I think it was a very fruitful conversation that led us to think through ideas around how we could better serve people outside of that key persona. And especially, once again, not just from a product perspective, but also from a marketing perspective, really considering how design could be, marketing messaging could be more inclusive, things on Instagram, social, all of those various elements, and even how you reach those customers. So when you think about where does your customer, when you focus on just that one persona, or maybe there's a few personas that you have at your company, you're really focused so much on that person, and I say person here as like that persona or that archetype, and you're focusing on this idea of like, how do you reach that person? Where does that person hang out? Where does that person surf online? Where is that person going to for their own inspiration, which competitors might they be viewing, and that's really great. But when we start to think about who we're missing, we also broaden the landscape on other ways we might engage that customer, bring that customer in, and that, going back to why this matters, really impacts your ability to grow. And depending on what the cost to acquire that customer is, it might actually be a really great investment to start thinking about other avenues because you originally started thinking about a different type of customer. Soren, how about you? I know you've done a lot of different projects with these questions in mind.
Yeah, I would say that your advice about starting with discovery, I think is the key point, and involving people every step of the way, because I think as we've seen with major product launches, such as the first launch of Twitter's voice tweets, and a couple of other things like Clubhouse, there can be a huge gap in features when they're launched without the input of people that will be using them. There were a lot of people that had really great ideas of how to kind of patch and fix these features. Just for context, voice tweet specifically was released without any kind of support for transcripts or any kind of way to export the sound and get a closed captioning or anything. But they did spend some time on creating this visual animation of the sound wave. So it was really a miss with a lot of people, because they could have spent some time developing that feature or integrating another party to bring that to life, but or just having somebody in the room to say this won't work. Sometimes you do have to say no, or we have to wait, or it's later. And I think that's an important voice to hear too, is sometimes you have to say we're not ready to build this out yet.
Yeah, that part is so key to me, because I think sometimes it seems like obvious, like let's internally test this, let's run it past different folks throughout the organization or customers that are willing to give some feedback early on. And it's really hard because, especially in product, right? You're in product design as well. You're trying to move so fast and ship product quickly and like live in a very agile way, which is so beneficial in a lot of ways, but oftentimes just taking that quick break, pause to reflect and incorporate inclusion into the process can prevent a lot of bad branding moments from not happening. I think in the book Building for Everyone, there's another really great example of this, which is the start of like VR headsets. And when the team was working on it, they really thought about not just like, how do we make a VR headset? And it wasn't the question. The question was, how do we make a VR headset that works for everyone? And the questions there are very different, right? So when they were building, and that now we're talking about a physical product that has technological capabilities, but really they were thinking not just about like, how does this fit on someone's head? It's really about, well, what if they have a bigger head, a smaller head? What if it's a child? What if it's an adult? What if their hair texture is this versus this? What if they're wearing glasses versus no glasses? And that's kind of how they got to this idea of an adjustable foam strap, which, who knows if you had just made it with one person in mind, if you would have come to that type of product decision. And as a result of that, that product is now accessible to so many more types of people, which once again impacts growth. All right, check the chat. Okay, cool. So how can we incorporate this thinking in our process? So when you're thinking about your own organization, as we stated at the start, it's not just about the actual product and how customers react to it. It starts all the way in product discovery and in ideation. So we're going to go through just some key components here. And then the next slide will focus on key examples. So when we think about ideation, it's broadening the research teams to include underrepresented groups, like what Soren mentioned, conducting focus groups with those folks, and making sure that teams are working cross-functionally throughout the discovery process, and it's not just product making decisions or the leadership team making decisions, but rather it's cross-functional because everyone has a different perspective from where they're standing. And then ensuring that if your company can select people to be inclusion champions, including them in the ideation process. And that doesn't mean it's on, one person to give it the green light that, yes, this is inclusive, let's go for it. It's really about making sure you have that diversity of thought in the room really early on. And then when we get into the design phases, when you're thinking about wireframes, mocks, whether that be Figma, InVision, whatever, it really thinking through making sure that you're also thinking about inclusion so that you can test whether it's usable, whether people will use it, whether it's actually going to address the problem for the thing that you're trying to solve for. And once again, not just obtaining feedback from leadership or whoever it might be in your organization, but also making sure you're obtaining feedback from others internally before it goes live. And then in the testing phase, really making sure that we're not just testing for someone who's, has full vision capabilities and has a Mac and an iPhone, but we're also testing other devices when we're talking about online products, and then in physical products, testing them in various scenarios to make sure that we didn't miss a big hole here. And then finally, when we think about marketing, this is where, you want to make sure that the way you're messaging your product makes sense for the world around us. You're featuring diverse stories, not just a very specific type of story. You want to strive for authenticity and telling relatable stories. So this is where, even if you want to hero diverse stories, making sure that those stories are told with authenticity, and that involves making sure that the person you're trying to represent or the persona that you're trying to represent is being crafted by someone who can relate to that background. And kind of building off of that, this idea of challenging stereotypes, really making sure that we're not pushing a certain stereotype in whatever that marketing message might be. And then understanding your brand's role and taking accountability for that. So making sure that it's not just about the thing you put out there, it's how you react to that thing depending on customer feedback you might get from it. Soren, I want to lean on you here, mostly around design, because this is where your expertise lies.
Yeah, I would say that early and often is the rule of thumb there to get feedback. Even just trying to get together low fidelity things and run through flows, doing focus groups, doing user testing. It's amazing what kind of insight you can get just from showing someone and getting their reaction to even a paper mock-up. So I would say lean on resources to do moderated and unmoderated testing. If you, like a lot of people, have trouble with sourcing folks for accessibility testing, that's one area that I find people have a lot of trouble with, because it's not something that we are comfortable about asking about in a lot of areas of the world. Fable is a company that specializes in recruiting people that have disabilities. And so that everyone that is in their group will be testing with their lived experience in mind, and they can give you really accurate manual testing. So I would say that's a really great way to do it. And also there's a lot of automated tools out there. I've always been a big advocate for Stark, which is a tool that you can use inside of your design tools. Excuse me. And you can check contrast, and you can check all kinds of tab order and all kinds of things that you can do with, I'm so sorry, Stark. And I would say that find the tools that work for you. There's code-based tools as well that you can run in your browser. And just automated tools check about 50% of the issues that you can run against, but you have to get that manual testing in. And I would say if you aren't testing with people that have disabilities or people that are impacted by the decisions that you're making, either on forums or in marketing even, then you're just getting somebody else to make a decision for that marginalized group.
Yep. Yep. I totally agree. And I think you bring up a really good point around tools and this idea whenever we think about build versus buy, right? A lot of times there's so many people out there that have come up with these really great technologies around helping your company and your product be more inclusive. So I think it's such a great way, if you're able to invest in it to do that, because to your point, you're future proofing. And by bringing in those tools early on, you're really starting to think about that as not just something we have to do, but something that's actually going to yield a better return versus not doing it. Okay, so here, a same framework here, but really focused on example questions that you should be asking yourself throughout each of these phases and asking each other, right? So I think it's really, especially as a PM, when you're working on your own idea, I'm like, yeah, I know who this product is for. I totally get it. I know my customer, I know who I'm missing, but like, it's so easy to get in the weeds and forget to pick your head up and look around and think, who am I missing? Who is being overlooked? Is this product supportive of low-income users? If low-income users are someone that I decided that like I would like to focus on for this product in particular, did I miss any cultural or societal norms that I really should have considered? I think this is really important, especially if your company's looking to scale into new markets or go international. It's very easy to think like, oh, we can just copy and paste and use the same materials or product offerings in a different demographic, but that will not work. I can almost promise you, if you're not taking the time to think through those key questions. And sometimes my best tool here is to ask another PM or ask a product designer who's not on my team or a developer not on my team, or a cross-functional stakeholder that I don't see, what they do every day, because they oftentimes have really great ideas or will push me on things that I felt, I was very confident in because I didn't even stop to think about their perspective or a customer that they might be representing. When it comes to design, this is where kind of what Soren was mentioning, you can have tools that might pick up on this, but it's only going to catch so much. So it's really important to ask yourself if your wording is inclusive, if you're using really like complex jargon, which going back to the voting ballot example, is that going to capture the market for voting, which, should be theoretically everyone. And then is more than one language supported? Are there racially or ethnically inclusive images or graphics? This happens a lot when we think about icons, when we think about avatars. We often put one image out there instead of thinking through, once again, who are we missing? Are there multiple input modes? And this is a lot about what Soren was mentioning as well around speech, keyboard, mouse, touch, different ways to get at the same thing, the same way that you might have one CTA in different parts of your product. It's all going to pull you into the same place, but we should be thinking about that same way of getting to one place through different modes when we think about various users who might not have access to the primary mode that you are trying to push. Making sure there's sufficient contrast with text and backgrounds. Things are easy to read. Instructions are easy to understand. ADA accessibility. This goes back to the point around doing it to future-proof and not because you have to. Although with ADA, there's also portions of it that you have to do. If you think about a restaurant, right, making sure it's wheelchair accessible, things like that. And then when we get into testing, it's really making sure that there are a diverse set of users in your testing process. It's not just that one person who's in charge of giving the green light to ship to production. It's making sure that there's testers in a range of locations, so you can test things like bandwidth and internet service for people who might not have access to high-speed internet, and making sure that there's that part of it includes testing the assistive technology elements of it. So did you test the speech elements of it? Did you test some of the really great accessibility actions that Apple has in place? And then from a marketing perspective, this really goes back to around branding, right? Does your message cater to a diverse audience? How closely does the product usage align with that predicted usability and those expectations? And this is where feedback becomes really important. So it's not, I think, these stages really focus on getting the product out the door, but then what happens when it's out there? What happens when you're looking at your output metrics or your outcomes and really thinking through not just did growth go up or whatever, or did revenue go up? It's actually thinking about how did this impact NPS? What kind of customers feedback are we getting? And then thinking about how you might now build on that product to make it even better, not just for the key business metric you're driving, but also in order to make sure it's as inclusive as it could be. And then thinking through unintended consequences. Once again, this goes back to kind of what I was saying in ideation, where you're really focused on, you have your head down, you're really focused on the specific thing that you're working on. And let's say that might be revenue in an example. And so you're like, yes, we're going to drive revenue. We're going to drive revenue. We're going to drive revenue. It gets out there and you drove revenue. Great. Success. We'll call it a day. But sometimes there's unintended consequences to what happens. And so if we're not keeping, our mind open to those, we might miss something. Like, yes, revenue did go up, but we saw a lower NPS score or some other type of unintended consequence that might come into play as a result of being really focused on just one element or one customer. Soren, anything to add there?
I would say that, the unintended consequence thing is big. And sometimes, just like the whole Twitter voice tweet thing, you just don't know what's coming. And that's why it's really good to have that voice in the room.
Yeah, I think that's really important when you think about marketing, right? Because you might think about, we're going to do a marketing campaign for this new product we launch, and you did see growth in that product as a result, but maybe there was an unintended consequence of negative feedback from an image you used or a certain copy choice that you made that didn't sit right with a certain demographic of people. Okay, so the big question, is it worth doing? A lot of the things that we talked about might feel like they're slowing your process down. They're preventing you from becoming as agile as you want to be. They're preventing you from shipping product faster and getting customer feedback faster. And that might be true. That might be true. And I think that the hardest thing about product inclusion, for me at least, is this idea that when I want to do something that's focused on inclusion within a product, it's always going to be stacked up against other things that need to get done, right? And that is the hardest thing about being a product manager sometimes, is really having to ruthlessly prioritize. And when you ruthlessly prioritize, the feature or the whatever it might be that's focused on inclusion might get deprioritized. And that's, in my experience, oftentimes maybe has something to do with the fact that it's harder to quantify. It's harder to know what the return is going to be on this investment. And so, I don't want to have, Soren and I run through this presentation without acknowledging that it's not always going to be that perfectly inclusive, really like bringing everyone into the fold to do it, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. I think the best way, just like I would say this for any other product decision, is if you can, test it, see how it goes, see how this process goes. And the idea isn't to add days and weeks to your product process. The idea is just to start by understanding how you can start to ask yourself different questions, how you can start to ask your colleagues different questions in order to push yourself to further innovation that you might not have done otherwise. Soren, any thoughts on how you've had to balance? Should we do this?
Yeah, I would say too that anytime you move towards transformation, it feels slow because it is different from the way that you have done things before. I have been really lucky to work at some companies that have already been part of a digital transformation, and they've already done the entire process before I've gotten there. And so I feel like, I've been able to step in and say, I'm here, I'm ready, like, let's do UX, let's do it. And then there's been some companies that I've been a part of that I'm coming in at the very beginning, and it is an uphill battle because everyone has to be changing the way that they're thinking. And so they are often second guessing the choices that they're making. And there's a lot of reassurance or saying, oh no, well, this wasn't done the right way, so we do have to go back. It's very measure twice, cut once. So I would say that once you get the hang of designing with inclusion, it doesn't take longer. It really doesn't, because what you're doing is you're just involving more voices in the process. And, once you start recruiting designers that have the lived experience and making sure that your teams are diverse and that you have product owners that you can call on, and that you have, like people in your organization that just represent all of the things that you're looking to really pull from, that you can have those experiences in-house, you can have those experiences with your user. And once it's a part of your workflow, it's hard to go back. It's really hard to say, like, I'm now not going to talk to users, and I'm not going to involve everyone in my process. So those relationships are already built then, but it does take work to build relationships from nothing. So I would say that's it is worth doing, because it's, for all the reasons that you should be doing it, there's probably 5 more. I think that you never know, like, what kind of difference that you're making to someone too. Just to get a little bit personal, I work in this space all the time, and I never think about, like, what could this mean to someone personally when they run across this. And I just had the experience of someone reaching out to me and saying, like, oh, we're doing this inclusive thing, and I was just like, it's reading this email, and I've just felt like overcome with, like, oh wow, like I feel like so seen as like a person that this is happening. So I would say that for all of these reasons, it's totally worth doing. And it really changes the experience that your employees have as well. Because if they don't feel like that there is a place for them to be there, as a user even, then they may not stay. So I would say that if you want quality people and you want to retain them, that you would be inclusive. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't have people like that at my organization. Like, I don't know anybody that uses they, them pronouns like you do, Soren. You're the first person I've ever met.
Right.
And then I say to them, I'm the first out person that you've ever met, because there's not space for it.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's everything you said. Definitely agree with it. And I think one thing you touched on was this, we didn't actually talk a lot about the internal employees and how, if they are diverse, and if you're thinking about DEI within your personnel, right? But within your team, I don't really like the word personnel, because it is a team. It's a team of humans that you are working with in order to serve other humans. So I think that what you touched on there is really key. We focused a lot on product inclusion in the product process, but I think in order for that product process that we walk through to be successful, the people around you in the workplace need to represent the people that you are trying to service. So that, I think, is also a really great point that you touched on. And the last thing before we jump to questions, once again, would love it if you all could type this in the chat, but it's a very personal thing. So paper and pen is also fine. What is one thing you commit to doing differently to ensure others are thought of? And sorry, I'm going to ask you your answer to this, so I'll give you a second to think about it.
Yeah, I think like for me, one thing that I'm committed to doing is to advocating to involve our users at every step.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard shift to make.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. My answer to this was actually going to be sometimes when I do workshops as like a kickoff session or an ideation session, I create them with my personality in mind, and I create them like everyone's going to share. It's been great, and because who doesn't love to talk, and I forget that not some people, their type of thinking style or creativity style is actually to have internal reflection. So one way that I commit to ensuring others were thought of is that in a product discovery session, instead of asking people to share out, give everyone 5 minutes of individual reflection time, because that's oftentimes how other people like to process their thoughts prior to sharing them aloud. And I forget that because that is not how I work. Cool. And I see another one in the chat to share this presentation, which is a great answer too. Thank you for that. Okay, I want to open it up to see if there are any other questions or anything in Q&A that people want to know.
I have a question.
Yes.
How did you get started in your inclusion journey for getting into product?
Yeah, that's a great
Inclusion.
question. For me, so I think DEI is always something I've been really interested in, throughout college and early into my career. But I think that 2020 was a really pivotal moment for me, obviously, with just the state of the world and constantly seeing how the world was transforming around me. But then I still came to work every day and was trying to just be a product manager that like wrote my tickets and did my discovery and like communicated with stakeholders, but then like would turn on the news or see an article, and it was really hard. Like, and I originally approached it as like, okay, I'm going to separate, work and life, or work life in the news, or whatever that might be. And then I really was like, what if there's a world where these two things came together? I love being a product manager. I love my job. But I also feel like I have an obligation to want to do more for society outside of what I'm doing in my day-to-day job. So found out there's a thing called product inclusion and read the book Building for Everyone and was really inspired by that story. And yeah, that's kind of how I got here. What about you?
Oh, we've got some questions
Oh, perfect.
in the chat, so I'll get to those. Is there any additional training out there that you would recommend?
I would recommend reading Building for Everyone. And then there's also a really great small company based out of New York called the Inheritance Project. Does a lot of really great training on called like unpacking your cultural inheritance. And I think the biggest thing around being really great at product inclusion is understanding yourself and being really vulnerable with yourself. And that workshop makes you unpack things that you maybe don't want to unpack. And so those are two great resources that I love. What about you?
Yeah, there's some agencies that I've worked with that are doing really great work, and I'm kind of like, I worked with I have worked for Jack Strategy before, and I've really loved a lot of the content that like a person I had the privilege of interviewing, Amelie, put out this guide to allyship. And so there's like some people that are doing great work out there. I'd say it depends on what you're interested in learning about, that it's really good to focus on people that are in that group and listening to them. So yeah, I would say seek out resources by the people. There's a big phrase in disability justice, which is nothing for us without us. So I would say carry that as a banner over your heart.
Yeah, I love that. And let's see, one more question here, some success stories. So right before I ended my time at Havenly, I actually got the opportunity to work on a really cool feature, which was adding pronouns for designers. So Havenly is a platform that connects people to interior designers. and being able to view that designer's profile and adding the addition of pronouns was, felt so small, and it was small in the amount of dev effort it took to make it happen, the amount of product design effort it took to mock it up, but it made such an impact from the way that we were presenting our designers. It made a big impact to the designers when we communicated to them that we would be adding this feature. They were really excited because we were allowing them to better represent who they are when presenting their portfolios to the world. And I think that it was a very small step to a long journey when you think about inclusion, right? So that was something I was pretty excited about. And we are right at time, so we can end there. Thank you all so much, Soren. Thank you. I think your perspective is so different from mine when we talk about inclusion. So I've also learned so much from you. Thank you. All righty. So thank you all. Please reach out to us, either of us on LinkedIn. If you have any questions or thoughts, all feedback is always welcome. And enjoy the rest of Denver Startup Week. All right, bye, everyone.